A quiet weekend at a remote cabin. A game that starts with innocent dares, but things quickly spiral into something none of them expected. You won't believe where this night leads. The call came out of nowhere, catching me right in the middle of a quiet Friday evening. Come to the cabin, she said, her voice warm yet somehow mysterious. The weather's perfect, and I thought you might like a change of scenery. Bring your friend, too. I hesitated. My stepmother, Rachel, wasn't someone I usually spent time with one-on-one, and the idea of an invitation to her remote cabin felt strange, to say the least. Rachel was in her early 50s, an outdoorsy woman with a calm yet commanding presence, not someone you would expect to enjoy board games or casual weekends. But her tone had an undeniable pull, and I figured a little escape wouldn't hurt. I messaged my friend Tom, and told him the plan. Tom, a 28-year-old project manager with an easygoing nature, wasn't the type to pass up an adventure. We both needed a break from the grind of daily life in Portland, Oregon. An hour later, we were winding down the old forest road, the dense trees and fading light adding an eerie charm to the evening. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, it felt like we'd stumbled upon a hidden retreat far removed from our usual routines. The place was tucked away deep in the woods, giving off an almost forgotten vibe. Rachel was already outside, standing on the wide wooden porch with a welcoming smile. Dressed casually in jeans and a loose sweater, she looked relaxed and at home in the rustic setting, as if the wilderness itself was her element. Glad you both made it, Rachel said, waving us inside with an inviting gesture. Inside, the cozy warmth of the cabin felt like stepping into another world. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, vintage trinkets, and various mementos from Rachel's many travels. It gave the impression that this was more than just a cabin, it was a sanctuary. She poured each of us a cup of tea, and we settled in, exchanging light conversation as the evening slipped into night. I thought we could have a bit of fun tonight, Rachel said, breaking the lull. There was a playful gleam in her eyes as she reached behind a stack of books and pulled out an old, dusty box. The label was faded, but I recognized it immediately, an old board game from my childhood. It was one of those games where strategy mattered, but luck often decided the winner. Really? This game? I laughed, surprised by her choice. Tom raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting a board game night either. It's been years since I played this, Rachel said with a grin. I thought it might be a nice change of pace, something to get us talking and laughing. Besides, I don't get company out here often, so what do you say? Though it felt a bit out of place, her enthusiasm was contagious. Tom and I exchanged a quick glance and shrugged. Why not? We moved over to the large table by the fireplace, setting up the game while Rachel sat across from us, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. So, let's add a little twist, she suggested as we sat down. How about every time someone loses, they have to do a dare? Something harmless, just to keep it interesting. A part of me hesitated, but her smile was so reassuring that I couldn't refuse. Tom seemed equally unsure but nodded along. The first few rounds were light-hearted, filled with laughter and silly dares like sharing a funny story or mimicking a scene from a random movie. Then, Rachel lost a round, and when I jokingly asked her what her dare would be, she paused thoughtfully. All right, she said with a playful twinkle in her eye, how about I let one of you pick? It seemed innocent enough, but the way she said it gave me pause. Tom and I exchanged glances before he blurted out, okay, how about you give one of us a kiss on the cheek? Rachel raised her eyebrows, clearly amused by the unexpected dare. Then, without hesitation, she shrugged. All right, if that's what you want. She leaned over and gave Tom a quick, playful kiss on the cheek before settling back down as if nothing unusual had happened. It was a small moment, but somehow it shifted the atmosphere in the room. The game continued, and as we lost ourselves in laughter and challenges, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was becoming a bubble, insulating us from the rest of the world. Every glance, every movement seemed to take on an extra layer of meaning. After a few more rounds, I lost, and Rachel turned to me with a challenging smile. "Your turn," she said, her voice light. "What will your dare be?" Caught off guard, I stumbled over my words, trying to think of something that wouldn't break the playful mood. Okay, tell us the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you," I said, laughing to hide my own nervousness. Her eyes sparkled as she leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the shift in focus. "Oh, I have a few of those," she said with a chuckle. "But here's one. I was on a hiking trip, and I wandered into the wrong cabin by mistake. I ended up talking to a family for a good 20 minutes before I realized I was in the wrong place. I don't think I've ever run out of a room faster in my life." We all burst into laughter, and the tension that had started to creep in seemed to melt away. But even as we laughed, there was still something unspoken hanging in the air, a quiet charge that lingered as the night went on. As the fire crackled and the cabin was bathed in soft, flickering light, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between us. The game felt like an excuse, a way to prolong the evening, but the real tension was in the space between our words and the way we avoided acknowledging it. Rachel, in her early 50s but still radiating a youthful energy, watched us closely. Her deep brown hair, streaked with a few strands of gray, was tied back loosely, and her eyes, sharp and discerning, seemed to catch every flicker of emotion across our faces. Tom, usually so carefree, now seemed unusually quiet, his eyes flicking between me and Rachel with something unspoken on his mind. As the night wore on, we settled deeper into our seats, the flickering flames of the fireplace the only sound filling the cabin. Eventually, Rachel lost another round. She grinned, leaning back with her arms crossed. "All right," she said with a daring look, "what's my next dare?" This time, Tom seemed hesitant, but after a pause, he glanced at me before blurting out, "How about you share a secret, something you've never told anyone else?" I wasn't sure where the question came from, but it added a layer of seriousness to the evening that caught me off guard. Rachel raised an eyebrow, considering his request. Finally, she sighed, her voice softening. "Okay," she began slowly. "There's a place I go to in my mind, a spot in the woods, away from everything. When life gets overwhelming, I picture myself there, quiet, far from the noise. It helps me feel distant, like I can let go for a little while." Her words hung in the air, much heavier than any of us expected. I glanced at Tom, who looked just as surprised as I was by her vulnerability. None of us said anything for a moment, but then Rachel laughed softly, as if to shake off the mood. "See? Nothing too dramatic," she added with a smile, trying to return the conversation to its earlier lightness. The game continued, and before long, it was Tom's turn to face a dare. Rachel leaned forward, her gaze playful but sharp. "I dare you to step outside for a full minute without saying a word, just listen to the world around you." Tom looked puzzled but didn't argue. We watched as he stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. As soon as the door clicked shut, the cabin seemed to exhale, the silence suddenly thick between Rachel and me. She turned to me with a small smile, her gaze lingering just a moment longer than usual. "Your friend, he's an interesting guy," she said softly, her eyes locked on mine. The way she said it felt different, like she was hinting at something more. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity. Before I could say anything, Rachel reached across the table and gently placed her hand on mine. The warmth of her touch startled me, and for a brief moment, it felt like the room closed in around us, like we were the only two people there. The moment was fleeting, but it left me feeling unsettled. Before I could react, the door creaked open, and Tom stepped back inside, looking slightly confused. He glanced between the two of us, sensing that something had shifted, but before he could ask, Rachel broke the silence. "You're back just in time," she said, her tone light and cheerful, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "I guess it's my turn to lose again," she added with a mock sigh. She tilted her head toward me. "Well, what's the next dare?" This time, Tom took the lead, though I could tell he was still uncertain. "How about," he began, then paused, glancing at me for a split second before continuing. "How about you give him a kiss on the cheek for good luck in the next round?" My pulse quickened, and I wasn't sure if this was just a playful suggestion or if he had sensed the unspoken tension between Rachel and me. She hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering slightly as she considered it. Then, with a small shrug, she leaned toward me. Her face was close enough that I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, a soft, floral scent that somehow made the moment feel more intimate. The kiss itself was nothing more than a light brush of her lips against my cheek, quick, almost innocent, but it lingered in the air like an unspoken secret. I barely breathed as she leaned back, her gaze meeting mine with a slight sparkle that made it seem like she knew exactly what effect the moment had on me. Tom looked away, scratching the back of his neck, clearly picking up on the tension now filling the room. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted again. We returned to the game, but now every roll of the dice, every glance or movement, felt charged with an energy that none of us wanted to acknowledge. We played in silence, each of us hyper-aware of the others, pretending that nothing unusual had happened. As the night grew darker and the fire burned low, the room seemed to cocoon us in a heavy quiet. The tension in the air was undeniable, yet none of us spoke about it. I could feel the weight of what hadn't been said pressing down on me, and from the glances Tom kept throwing my way, I knew he felt it too. As the night wore on, my thoughts grew more tangled, and I found myself stealing glances at Rachel. Each time, I caught her watching me with that same knowing look, as if she could see what I was thinking but wasn't going to say it out loud. Tom, usually full of jokes, had gone quiet, his laughter forced and strained. I realized he was just as aware of the shift in the air as I was. Finally, the game ended, leaving us sitting in an awkward silence. Rachel began collecting the game pieces, her hands moving slowly, deliberately, as if the pieces themselves held secrets she wasn't ready to share. "Maybe we should call it a night," she said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. She didn't look up from the table, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken hung heavily in the room. The next morning, I woke to the soft light filtering through the cabin's curtains, feeling a mix of confusion and anticipation. Tom and I hadn't exchanged many words after the night's game, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. What had started as an innocent gathering had somehow crossed an invisible line, one I hadn't even realized existed until it was too late. My mind replayed those brief moments from the night before, the look Rachel had given me, the warmth of her hand, the brush of her lips against my cheek. It all felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't quite piece together. I got up, trying to shake off the strange feelings from the night before, and found Tom already in the kitchen, his face serious. He didn't bring up the previous evening, instead, we ate breakfast in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. Just as we were finishing, Rachel entered the kitchen, cheerful and at ease, as if nothing unusual had happened. She wore a simple sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and greeted us with a warm smile. "Good morning, boys," she said, filling her mug with coffee before sitting down at the table. Her ease only made the confusion more pronounced. It was as if she didn't notice the tension hanging in the air, the unspoken discomfort that seemed to cling to every corner of the room. "Did you two sleep well?" she asked, her eyes scanning both of us. Tom mumbled something about the cozy cabin bed, while I just nodded, avoiding eye contact. Rachel glanced at the clock, then looked back at me with a raised eyebrow. "I was thinking of taking a walk around the lake," she said. "Would either of you like to join me?" Tom hesitated, then shook his head. "You go ahead. I think I'll stay here, maybe read for a bit." His voice was awkward, like he was making an excuse to avoid the situation, though I wasn't sure he understood what exactly he was trying to avoid. And so, I found myself walking with Rachel to the lake, the cabin grounds unusually quiet, the morning mist still hanging low over the water. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of the trees. As we reached the edge of the lake, Rachel stopped, staring out over the calm water. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I don't get to come here very often anymore. Life has a way of keeping me busy." She glanced at me, her expression softened by the morning light. "I'm glad you and Tom came." There was something about the way she said it that made my heart skip a beat. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, looking down at the ground, suddenly feeling like a teenager caught between confusion and excitement. After a moment, Rachel turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know last night was a little unusual." Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to pretend everything was normal, but another part of me felt drawn in, as if there was something more to her words that I needed to understand. I managed a small smile. "Yeah, it was different," I said, feeling both curious and unsure. Rachel looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Then she stepped closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Different isn't always bad," she said softly, lightly brushing her hand against my arm. The touch was brief, but it left a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. She smiled at me, a hint of mischief in her eyes, before stepping back, breaking the moment just as quickly as it had come. We continued walking along the lake's edge, trying to return to normal conversation. We talked about books, movies, the peacefulness of the cabin, but the silence between our words felt thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was as if we were both avoiding the elephant in the room, something we didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore either. When we returned to the cabin, Tom was still sitting on the porch, reading a book, though his posture seemed tense. His expression was neutral, but the way he glanced at me when we walked up made it clear that he had noticed something. Rachel went inside, leaving me alone with him for the first time that morning. Tom avoided looking at me, but I could tell something was on his mind. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke, his voice low. "So, what's going on, man? Last night was strange, right?" I shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Yeah, I guess. It was just a game." Tom gave me a look that told me he wasn't buying it. "A game?" "Sure. But it didn't feel like just a game." I didn't have an answer for him. The silence between us grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut through. He shook his head, looking down as if trying to make sense of everything. "I don't know, man. I don't know," he muttered. Before I could respond, Rachel reappeared, holding a fresh cup of coffee and smiling at both of us as if nothing unusual had happened. "So, what's the plan for today?" she asked, her tone light and casual, almost too casual, given the circumstances. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I think I'll head into town for a bit," he said, glancing between us. "Maybe pick up some supplies." Rachel nodded, her smile never faltering. "That sounds like a great idea. We could use a few things." As Tom disappeared down the path toward his car, I found myself alone with Rachel once again. She leaned against the porch railing, watching him walk away. "Looks like it's just the two of us," she said with a playful tone that sent a strange mix of excitement and apprehension through me. With Tom gone, the cabin felt even quieter. The morning light had given way to a soft, overcast afternoon, casting a calm yet heavy atmosphere over the lake and trees. I could feel the tension growing again, the unspoken weight between us getting stronger. Rachel turned to me, her expression softer now, almost thoughtful. "It's nice having you here," she said, her voice gentle. "I don't get much company out here. It reminds me of simpler times." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something in her tone, something almost nostalgic, as if she were thinking of a different life, long past. She straightened up, brightening suddenly. "How about a quick game to pass the time?" At first, I thought she meant another round of the board game, but she gestured to a small shelf filled with books. "It's a guessing game," she explained. We take turns describing the plot of a book without mentioning the title, and the other person has to guess which one it is. I agreed, curious where this would lead. Rachel picked up a worn novel and began describing it, her voice full of warmth and enthusiasm. I tried to focus on piecing together her clues, but I found myself more captivated by the way she spoke, the way her eyes lit up when she described the stories. As the game continued, our conversation turned more personal, as if each book we described revealed a bit more of who we were beneath the surface. We laughed, sharing memories, and for a while, the tension from earlier seemed to fade away. The cabin felt lighter, more familiar, as if we had returned to that easygoing atmosphere from the start of the weekend. But then, as if sensing the change herself, Rachel placed the book back on the shelf, her hand lingering on its spine. She turned to me, her gaze serious now, her eyes holding a strange intensity. "You know," she began softly, "there's something about being out here, away from everything. It feels like time just stops." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. I wasn't sure what she was leading to, but I could feel the shift, the silence thickening between us. Rachel stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine, her hand reaching up to brush a piece of hair from my forehead. The gesture was intimate, gentle, and caught me completely off guard. "Sometimes I think we let too many moments pass us by," she murmured, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. Before I knew what was happening, she was leaning in, her face so close I could feel the warmth of her breath. Her lips brushed against mine, soft and brief, yet enough to send a spark of electricity through me. I pulled back, startled, searching her face for some explanation, but her expression was calm, almost as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but no words came. Instead, I found myself drawn back in, as if that brief touch had awakened something I hadn't realized was there. This time, when she leaned in again, her lips met mine with a gentle certainty, the kiss soft and lingering, full of an intensity that left me almost breathless. Just as quickly as it started, the sound of footsteps on gravel shattered the moment, and we both pulled away, startled. Tom had returned, his face neutral but his eyes sharp, taking in the scene before him. I could feel the surge of guilt wash over me as I realized how easily I had let myself get caught up in the moment. Rachel quickly composed herself, greeting Tom with a casual smile, though there was a slight tremor in her voice that I could sense. "You're back early," she said lightly, though the tension in the air was hard to miss. "Yeah," Tom replied curtly. "I figured I'd just grab a few things and head back." He dropped the bag of supplies on the kitchen counter, not meeting either of our eyes as he busied himself with unpacking. His movements were quick and tense, his shoulders tight with unspoken frustration. The weight of what had just happened hung over the room like a heavy fog. I felt a deep urge to say something, to explain, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. The silence was suffocating, filled with questions that neither Rachel nor I could answer. Finally, Tom looked up, his gaze fixed on me. His eyes were filled with confusion, hurt, and something I couldn't quite place. "So," he began, his voice low but steady, "what exactly have I walked in on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Rachel cut in before I could speak, her tone calm but firm. "It's not what you think," she said, though her words sounded hollow, even to me. "We were just caught up in the moment." Tom's bitter smile told me he wasn't convinced. "Caught up in the moment, huh?" he repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm not blind, you know." Another heavy silence fell over us, and I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, guilt, regret, confusion. How had things gotten so complicated so quickly? What had started as an innocent weekend getaway had turned into something I couldn't control. Rachel stepped closer to Tom, her expression softening. "I'm sorry if this made you uncomfortable," she said gently. "That was never my intention." Tom let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Uncomfortable? That's putting it lightly." His gaze flickered between us, filled with disappointment and something else, betrayal, maybe. I couldn't be sure, but I knew I had crossed a line I hadn't even realized was there. "I think I'll take a walk," Tom muttered, heading for the door without waiting for a response. The tension in his shoulders was unmistakable as he disappeared outside, leaving Rachel and me alone in the thick silence once again. Rachel sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair, her face pale. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Her voice was heavy with regret, and I could tell that she, too, was struggling with what had just unfolded. I stood there, at a loss for what to say. The weight of the situation seemed to grow with each passing second, the awkward silence between us becoming almost unbearable. I glanced toward the window, watching as Tom walked down the path, his figure disappearing into the trees. Guilt gnawed at me, guilt for letting things go too far, for hurting a friend who had trusted me. Rachel looked at me with sad eyes, her voice soft. "Maybe we all need some time to think," she said quietly, her words filled with a sense of finality. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if time would be enough to repair the damage that had been done. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy quiet. Tom didn't come back for hours, choosing to wander around the lake alone. Inside the cabin, Rachel and I moved around each other, careful to avoid eye contact, the tension between us too thick to ignore. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the warmth in the room had all but disappeared. By evening, Tom finally returned, his expression unreadable as he grabbed his bag and began packing without a word. His movements were deliberate, leaving no room for conversation. I watched him, knowing that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. Tom turned to me, his eyes hard and distant. "I'm heading out tonight," he said, his voice flat. "You can stay if you want. I'll figure out my way back." His words hit me harder than I expected. "Are you sure?" I asked, not knowing what else to say. "Yeah," he muttered, grabbing his things and brushing past me without looking back. His footsteps were heavy as he left the cabin, each step a reminder of the growing distance between us. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Take care," she whispered as Tom walked past her, her voice barely audible. Tom gave a brief nod but didn't look at her. His gaze was distant, almost hollow, as he disappeared down the path, swallowed by the darkening woods. A strange emptiness settled over the cabin, the silence feeling final, as though Tom had taken something with him when he left. I felt a deep twist of regret in my chest, knowing that the connection between us, between all of us, had changed, perhaps irreparably. I turned to Rachel, hoping to find some comfort or clarity in her expression, but her face was lined with sadness, her eyes distant. She sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything that had happened. "I never meant for it to go this far," she murmured, her voice quiet, almost broken. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say to fix the situation, nothing that could undo the choices we had made. Rachel walked slowly over to the fireplace, staring into the dying embers as the faint, flickering glow cast long shadows across the room. For a moment, she stood there, lost in thought, before turning back to face me, her expression softened by a deep regret. "I think we both need some space," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made it clear there was no room for argument. This wasn't supposed to happen. Maybe it's better if we leave it as it is." Her words hung between us, heavy and final. I nodded, feeling an emptiness settle in my chest, an ache that words couldn't heal. The realization that this strange, intense moment would be left unresolved filled me with an inexplicable sadness. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but no words seemed adequate. As I gathered my things, preparing to leave, Rachel watched me with that same quiet sadness, a reflection of the emotions swirling inside of me. It felt as though we were both bracing ourselves for an ending we hadn't expected, one neither of us had been prepared for. I turned to the door, hesitating for a moment as I felt her gaze linger on me. She took a small step forward, as if to say something, to bridge the gap between us that had grown over the course of the weekend. But just as quickly, she stopped, her hand falling to her side. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I gave her a brief nod, unable to look her in the eye as I stepped out into the cold evening air. The chill hit me as I left the cabin, the darkness outside feeling like a weight on my shoulders. I glanced back, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, but the cabin remained still and quiet, its windows dark, as though the place itself was mourning what had been lost. As I walked down the narrow path, each step taking me farther from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. There were questions I hadn't asked, emotions I hadn't confronted, and a strange sense of loss that I couldn't quite name. My thoughts turned to Tom, his quiet anger and confusion when he had left. I wondered if things between us could ever return to what they had been before. But deep down, I knew that something fundamental had changed, and I wasn't sure it could ever be fixed. The lights from the cabin grew dimmer, fading into the distance, leaving only the dark outline of the trees around me. I felt as though I were leaving more than just a physical place. I was walking away from a part of myself that I couldn't take back. The memory of Rachel's touch, her kiss, lingered in my mind, haunting me as I made my way farther into the night. The silence was absolute, the path ahead stretching into an uncertain future. For a moment, I paused and glanced back one last time. In the distance, I thought I saw a faint glow from the cabin's window, a reminder of the strange bond we had shared, one that would remain unresolved. But just as quickly as the light appeared, it faded, leaving only the darkness behind. And in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. I had crossed an invisible line, one I could never uncross. The road ahead felt empty, filled with uncertainty, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever truly understand what had happened that weekend, or if it would remain an unanswered question, a shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. With each step I took, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid grew heavier, a quiet ache that settled deep within me.